On behalf of Beth Tzedec and Beit HaMinyan, I want to welcome all of you. I think all of us were not only saddened but shocked at Ben's passing, and Eddie and I felt that it would be important to gather together for Shloshim here to give many of his friends an opportunity to reflect on and to honor Ben's memory. And so I'm going to begin really by teaching something in memory of Ben, and the rest of the evening will consist of Michael Brown giving some biographical notes. Epi will also be teaching, and Howard Black, who's an old friend, and will speak about a special project in memory of Ben, and then we'll lead the Keil Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer at the end. Typology is when you read the Torah or any book and you notice parallels that could be considered to be deliberate, intentional parallels. And I want to suggest that there are a number of parallels between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther. Usually, we associate Yosef's story with Hanukkah. And I'll come back at the very end to ask why there might be an association with Purim. But first I want to take you to some of the textual parallels, and then I want to ask you some of the thematic ones. So the initial part I'll teach a little bit, and then the second part hopefully you will teach each other. So I want you to look at how each of them, or how the characters in the story of Esther and Mordechai, the Megillah, how they are appointed. And then I want you to look at what occurs in Bereshit. And I'm just talking about the language itself. So in the book of Esther, we begin, Vayafked HaMelech Pekidim B'chol Medinot, right? And they wind up giving advice, Vayitav HaDavar Be'enei HaMelech, and all of the advice was found to be good, suitable in the eyes of the king. And so the king followed through and convened this big party, or this big contest, to determine who would be the next queen. If you go back to Bereshit, you'll see a similar kind of language when Yosef is brought before Pharaoh. Yaseh Pharaoh vayafked pekidim, let the king appoint officers, al haaretz, over all the land, who are going to collect all of the produce and then will subsequently distribute it. Vayitav hadavar be'enei hamelech, be'enei paro, u'be'enei kol avadav. And this idea met with favor. So you see the language becomes, is parallel. I want you to take a look at how they're each described. Esther is described as Yifat Toar V'Tovat Mareh. She's beautiful in stature and appearance. And Yosef is Yefei Toar V'Yefei Mareh. And while it's not an exact, it's very close. So you see also that in describing Esther, I'd like to suggest that the author of the Megillah here is trying to hearken back to an earlier story. Each of them were favorites. Esther became a favorite in the eyes of the king. Vayehav HaMelech et Esther mikol hanashim. And she found favor in the eyes of the king above all of the other women. Vatisachen v'chesed lefanav mikol habtulot. And she found favor among all others who were chosen as contestants in this contest. And similarly, when you look back, you think of Yosef, who was the favorite of his father. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav. He loved Yosef above all of his sons. Vayiru achav ki oto ahav avihem mikol achav. So they also saw this. So it's not only that there is that the prime figure is seen as beautiful in the eyes of the king or in the eyes of his father, but also in other people's eyes. Now you know that as the Megillah goes forward, there is a whole series of interlinked plots, and one of them has to do with Esther, Mordechai, who is able to overhear a plot against Achashverosh. And when he overhears the plot, part of what pushes the plot is that the courtiers who are engaged in this intrigue are angry. And here again, the language is suggestive. Bayamim ahem, in those days, u'Mordechai yoshev b'shar hamelech. Then Katzav, Bigtan, v'Teresh. Bigtan and Teresh were angry. Who were they? They were the two Sarisei Hamelech. They were eunuchs who were in charge of the king's quarters, and that's part of what eunuchs did. They could be trusted because they weren't going to go after any of the women. And what's interesting is that if you look back at the whole question of Yosef and the two people that he meets in prison, one of them says, Paro katsaf, Pharaoh got angry at his servants, and all of us therefore were placed under guard. It's not necessarily that they were plotting, but certainly there's anger. It involves, in one case, people who are angry at the king, and in another case, the king who is angry. But there are also two plotters in each story. Now, you know that part of what helped Mordechai was the fact that when Mordechai exposed all of this, then the king ordered that all of this be recorded, and Vayichtov b'Sefer Divrei Hayamim Lifnei Hamelech. And then later, we find that when Achashverosh is unable to sleep, instead of listening to old sermons, he has the book brought out, and he effectively watches the equivalent of the television show that tells you what happened in the legislature. And he thinks that's going to put him to sleep. But on that point, he asked that the Sefer Zichronot, the Divrei Hayamim, be brought in front of him. Now, if you look at the time when the memory is twigged in the court of Pharaoh in Genesis, you find, first of all, the Lo Zachar Sar HaMashkim at Yosef, that the one who is in charge of the beverages, we usually translate as the butler, that person didn't do it. That is, he forgot Yosef. But later, when Pharaoh has his dreams and he is unable to sleep, at that point we have the Sar HaMashkim who says, Et Chata'ai Ani Mazkir Hayom. So you have this idea of Zichronot and also of the sovereign who is unable to sleep. Now, certain things occur repeatedly. In the story of Esther, we know that Haman keeps going past this guy, Mordechai, and Mordechai every day doesn't get up. And then, Vayhi ki amram elav yom vayom v'lo shama alehem. Every day, yada, 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 it keeps coming back. And Mordechai doesn't listen. Well, if you look at Bereshit, you'll see that there is something that also occurred yom, every day, v'lo shama aleha. And that is when Mrs. Potiphar is attempting to seduce Yosef. She keeps going back in front of him every day, and he doesn't respond. And if you look on page 3, you'll see that when in Esther the king wants to appoint somebody, in this case it's Haman, that he takes the ring off of his hand, Vayisar Pharaoh et tabato me'al yado, and he gives it to the person who is going to be named in authority. And similarly in Bereshit, when Pharaoh will appoint Yosef, he also removes the ring from his hand. And you have similarly the sense of the tearing of garments in both. And you have an interesting doubling of language. It's not the same word, but it is the same type of doubling of language. When in Esther's case she says, go gather everybody, v'chasher avadati, avadati. And in a similar way, in the story of Yosef, that when he's informed that Binyamin, when Yosef's father, Yaakov, is informed that Binyamin is now in Egypt, or is wanted to go down to Egypt, that whoever this guy is who's in charge now in Pharaoh's house, that person wants Binyamin to come down, and Yehuda says, we have to do it. And when that occurs, Yaakov says that, okay, I have to do this. Vani kasher shacholti. You know, if I'm going to be left childless, I'll be left childless. And of course, in the end, it wasn't the St. Patrick's Day parade, but nonetheless, there was a sense that when you went on the parade route, that you took whatever you were going to be riding on, vayarkivehu barachov vayir vayikra lefanav. You have to be escorted through on some sort of horse, or as we'll see perhaps in a chariot, and the other people call in front, they announce in front, kacha yaseh, or they announce in front, avrech, bow down. So I think what I've tried to do here, and I hope successfully, is to show you that there's a lot of linguistic parallels. I want to ask you about thematic parallels that exist between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther. And we'll do that in less than 5 minutes. So very quickly, you tell me, what are some of the themes? I've got about 10 of them. Now you can certainly equal me because there are more heads than one. So what are some of the themes that you can immediately pick up? That's right. Here are Jews, or Hebrews, who rise to power in a foreign land, and they use their position and their power to save either their families or the Jewish people. Excellent.
Seemingly accidental act or event that redeems us or saves us is related to that.
Very important. We all know that in the story of Esther, God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah. We also know that in the Yosef story, while Yosef attributes things to God. In fact, God is quite quiet in the Joseph narrative. God is, I won't say absent, but at least overtly absent. And it's only if one looks underneath, beyond the curtain, one sees that somehow God is secretly directing things. What are some other major themes that you can come up with? You two are the only ones who have read the Bible?
We're the only ones that study it.
No. I think there are others here who study.
Both happens after a long period. The length of the story, one is the Babylonian exile, and it was decades or a century later, and the other was hundreds of years.
Okay, but they both involve something that takes place outside of the land of Israel. Okay? What are some other themes?
This is I don't like to use the word depart to, because we think of it as a negative way. But in both cases, it's foreign king and the Jew.
Here it is. The Jew who not only turns the tide, but in some way also has an effect on the entire nation. And we see that because at the very end of the Yosef story, there's this whole new tax land policy. And at the end of the story of Esther, there is also a tax collection policy, which doesn't it doesn't fit into the rest of the Megillah, but you have to kind of see this perhaps as a typology. It's reading backwards and bringing it back up to date. What are some other themes? Very quickly. I'm just going to give you some. First of all, Yosef is the descendant of not only Yaakov, but also Rachel. And Mordechai, what is his yichus? Where is Mordechai from? He's from the tribe of Binyamin. And Binyamin is the other son of Rachel. Right. Yosef is put into a position before the famine. And what happens in the Megillah story? Well, Esther is put into position before the plot against the Jews will develop. The trufah precedes the makkah, we would say in Hebrew. When the Yosef story reaches a climax, what happens? You know, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Right? Judah comes, approaches, and makes a plea. And what happens in the Esther story? Okay? That Esther goes to make the big plea. Now, there's also a revealing of identity, a disclosure of identity. Yosef to his brothers, and Esther to the king. Yosef, you know, brings his family to Pharaoh, and what does Pharaoh give them? Land. And Esther reveals her relationship to Mordechai, and Achashverosh places Mordechai in charge of the land. What happens when they can't sleep? I already mentioned that. And each narrative also has a recurring event. What is it in the story of Yosef? Dreams. Dreams in the story of Yosef. Remember, Yosef dreams, and then later, Pharaoh dreams. And what about, what recurs in the story of the Megillah? Drinking, parties. Okay, parties recur. First there's the party where Vashti gets overthrown, and then there's the party when Esther is going to be selected. And as you've noticed already, first of all, it's this sense of the hidden hand of God. There's one other theme here, and that is that the story of Yosef leads into servitude, but ultimately to redemption. The Esther story doesn't finish that way. The Esther story finishes with the Jews, thank God, the table is turned, they've survived, but they are still in Persia. And what I want to suggest to you is that perhaps the writer of the Esther story wanted to suggest that the story was not yet finished. That there would be a time when, even though some Jews had already gone back under Darius back to the land of Israel, not all had, and I want to suggest that an underlying motif might be that there would still be a time when the Jews of Persia would go back, but it couldn't be written overtly because, after all, they were still in an alien land. I chose to teach this tonight because Ben loved this kind of study. He learned from Nechama Leibovich to read the text very carefully, to pull out the textual evidence, to lay it in front of us, and then to leave it for us to think about what the implications might be for us. In this case, we who live in Toronto, far from the walled city of Yerushalayim. Thank you.
Well, we've come together tonight with sadness in our hearts to remember the loss of a friend, colleague, teacher, and Rabbi Ben Hollander. But this is the month of Adar, the month of Purim, the most lighthearted of Jewish holidays, and the wind-up to Pesach, the holiday of joyous redemption. Masechet Ta'anit enjoins us, Mishenichnas Adar, Marbim B'Simcha, be extra joyful from the beginning of Adar. How do we do both at once? Remember, be sad, and at the same time, be happy. In a note written shortly after Ben died, Reuven Geller, She'ibadel L'chaim, noted that Ben was both passionate and funny. So, in the spirit of the season and of this occasion, I'm going to try in my remarks to evoke the two sides of Ben, the serious and the not so serious. I knew Ben before he was Ben. We met at the Chaim Greenberg Institute in Jerusalem in 1960, where we were students together with Judy, and that's where they met, and She'ibadlu L'chaim Tovim V'Arukim, Arnie Fine, later Rabbi Arnold Fine of Agudath Israel Synagogue in Ottawa, where they're also holding a memorial for Ben, Neil Kozadoy, later the editor of Commentary Magazine, and Steve Riskin, now Rabbi Shlomo Riskin of Efrat. Some of the students had had an intensive Jewish education. Ben, who had been heading towards a career as a professor of English, and others of us were not quite beginners, but our Hebrew wasn't fluent, and we were less well-schooled than many of our classmates, which led to an interesting encounter. As Ben used to tell, it was love at first sight between Judy and him. And after just a few weeks' acquaintance, they decided to get married, informed Judy's family and the indomitable Sylvia by phone, and headed for the registry office. They filled out the forms and handed them in. The clerk looked them over, and he barked at Ben, "Ata ravak." Well, that wasn't a word Ben knew, but he thought that the clerk's tone indicated something really undesirable. "Lo," he responded emphatically, thereby denying that he was a bachelor and disqualifying himself from being married. Fortunately, the clerk was sympathetic to students who had come to learn Hebrew, and the license was duly granted. By the end of the year at Machon Greenberg, Ben had learned the meaning of the word ravak, but he no longer had any need for it. Our paths crossed again at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where we found ourselves once more students in the same class. It was then that I got to know and experience Hollander generosity, hospitality, and inclusivity. Ben often invited classmates to Sylvia's for dinner or for Shabbat, and we were made to feel completely at home. I suspect that many of us here tonight came to know and appreciate that generosity of spirit that made the Hollander home, whether it was in New York, Toronto, or Jerusalem, open house for all comers at any and all times. Our seminary student year in Israel included the Six-Day War, and significantly for Ben and Judy, the birth of Ilana, their first child. Ben and I also began our teaching careers together during those years at the seminary. Actually, Ben was my boss. He landed a job as principal of the Hebrew School of Temple Beth El of Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, and Judy was his vice principal. Now, to say that the kids were eager to learn or even to be there would be patently untrue. To say that the staff were experienced, well-trained, and able to engage the kids from the hood would be also patently untrue. I shudder to think of some of my own, shall we say, unorthodox attempts at keeping a modicum of order in the classroom. But Ben, with Judy's help, covered for me and the rest of the neophyte teachers and held it all together. And thanks to them, we managed to leave not before the end of the year and with our reputations intact. After our ordination from the seminary, we went in different directions. Ben had a pulpit not far from home in Pelham, and he joined the education staff of the Park Avenue Synagogue, one of Manhattan's most prestigious. Frankie Zal and I came to Toronto, and I began teaching at York. But chance, well, let's say good fortune, brought us together again. There was an opening for educational director at Beth Tzedec, and we urged Ben to apply. He came for an interview, and afterwards he sought my advice. "Do you think I'll get along with a senior rabbi?" he asked. "Oh," I said, "no problem on that score. He's so busy running the mega synagogue that he'll leave you on your own. You'll have a free hand." My career as a headhunter ended there and then. The exciting and tumultuous period that followed, and needs no rehearsing here, I remember Ben's going away present from the synagogue. It was a suitcase. And I think it was designed to last just long enough to get to his next destination. No return trips. But in that suitcase, he took cherished memories of the many friends and students with whom he had forged a close relationship during his very short stay in Toronto. And he left behind more than a little of himself in their hearts and minds. The degree to which Ben remained concerned about Beth Tzedec and maintained contact with his friends in the congregation was extraordinary. And the degree to which his friends remained loyal to him and to Judy was no less extraordinary. Every conversation between us in subsequent years included mention of Toronto and Beth Tzedec. Beth Tzedec members living in Israel, full or part-time, Stephen and Mark-Lee Glazer, Ben and Kerry Grossman, Al and Dorothy Gelman, Landy and Lori Samuels, and others were among his closest friends, while those who came for short visits never failed to touch base. He formed a Toronto study group in Jerusalem and remained, in a real sense, a part of Beth Tzedec. Nothing pleased him more than returning to the synagogue in recent years to conduct Rosh Hashanah tefillot and to give lectures. But if Ben always felt part of the Beth Tzedec community, he did not live in the past. In Israel, he moved on to several careers. One of the first was teaching in the new experimental high school in Lifta at the gateway to Jerusalem. Ben was teaching Tanakh, and the students were not religious. They were typical Israeli high schoolers, and according to one of them, Sivan Mas, who posted a notice on the web after Ben's death, he was one of the few teachers who could penetrate their teenage cynicism. When Sivan herself was chosen to participate in a delegation of young people to North America, she was told they might be invited to synagogue services. She came to Ben anxious and flustered. She had never been to a synagogue. She had never opened a siddur and had absolutely no idea of what to do. Ben prepped her for the experience. He opened doors for me, she writes, and gave me a set of keys to Jewish tradition that I carry with me still. Sivan today is Rabbi Sivan Mas. At the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, Ben taught future rabbis and cantors for the Reform movement. He taught traditional texts, led prayer services, and nurtured the students' relationship to Israel, both in class and at home, where he and Judy and the kids hosted them frequently for Shabbat meals. No small effort, I might add, given Judy's near total lack of interest in food. As the longtime teaching assistant of Israel's best-known and best-loved teacher of Bible, the Hebrew University's Nechama Leibovich, and then as her successor after her death, Ben worked with generations of students, helping to instill in them not only knowledge of the text, but love for it. Brian Strauss, a conservative rabbi in Houston, writes that Ben forever changed my love for Torah. And in addition to his classroom work, Ben, with Judy working behind the scenes, was a radio teacher on a regular Friday afternoon program on Parshat HaShavua. My last visit with Ben was in January when he and I and another friend paid a refuah shlema visit to a friend in Ra'anana who had recently suffered a stroke. The next night, we were both invited for dinner to the home of mutual friends in Jerusalem, one of whose sons, Mishi, is now at Harvard. Ben had tutored Mishi for his bar mitzvah, and Mishi, a bright boy, as you might imagine, was so taken with Ben that he continued studying with him until he entered the army. It was another example of Ben's unusual ability to communicate with his students, ba'asher heim sham, wherever they were coming from. For many years, Ben and Judy never left Israel. They were totally committed to the land and took seriously the rabbinic injunctions against leaving for any reason. More recently, they softened a bit. Judy came to visit family when they could no longer make the trip to Israel. Ben came to teach Torah. He also came to teach Israel. And I phrase it that way because he was always encouraging Aliyah, sometimes subtly, sometimes less subtly. He did guest lectures and locums in Ottawa and Toronto, in Chicago and Scranton, and in other places. He spent summers in Camp Ramah, and everywhere he was very well received. Mark Blumenthal of Evanston, Illinois, is another of those who posted notices on the web after Ben's death. He writes how moved he was by having time alone with Ben while driving him to the airport, and how much he had learned from listening to Ben's lectures. Blumenthal calls him the epitome of a mensch, a term used by several others in their postings. Rabbi Jack Cohen, the longtime Reconstructionist rabbi of Jerusalem, goes so far as to say that Ben was the kind of person who made the rabbinate an honorable profession. Now, Cohen is someone who likes to give a shtoch, but I suspect that what he is referring to here is mostly Ben's work with Rabbis for Human Rights, the interdenominational group of rabbis that battles for human rights in Israel of Arabs as well as Jews, of Reform and Conservative as well as Orthodox Jews, of women as well as men, of those who cannot easily speak for themselves as well as those who can. Some of Ben's friends admired him for his work in the organization, and others, I think, forgave him for it. But all recognized his hard work and his willingness to fight for a not always popular cause. He was a tireless advocate of dialogue and trying to find a modus vivendi for sharing the land which he so dearly loved and to which he, Judy, and their children committed their lives. On Shabbat, I noticed some psukim that I think would have drawn Ben's attention. Well, others would have too, of course, but a couple especially. The first in Parshat Vayikra. Daber el b'nei Yisrael lemor, nefesh ki techata bishgaga, mikol mitzvot Hashem asher te'asena, v'asa me'achat mehena v'chule. God said to Moses, tell the people of Israel, any person who transgresses a thou shalt not commandment can do penance and be forgiven. And Rashi notes here that the word nefesh, person, is used to indicate that the rule applies not only to members of the congregation, but to slaves and foreigners as well. The second pasuk is in the special haftarah for Shabbat Zachor from the book of Samuel. And there we are told, God commanded as follows, Ata lech v'hikita et Amalek v'acharamtem et kol asher lo v'lo tachmol alav v'heimata me'ish v'ad isha me'oleo v'ad yonek mishor v'ad seh migamal v'ad chamor. So God commanded that the Amalekites, who had tried to strike the people of Israel by hitting at the weak and the old at the end of the column, they should all be destroyed. The women and men, the children and infants, the oxen and the sheep, the camels and the donkeys. The animals, not because they were evil, but because they had belonged to evil people and therefore were muktzah. They were not to be used, to be touched. What Ben would have liked in both verses, I think, is their democracy and inclusiveness. All are responsible for the society in which they live, we are told in Samuel. All can be forgiven if they repent, we learn in Vayikra. And Ben, I think, would have subscribed to both those notions. He accepted personal responsibility for the institutions to which he belonged and the society in which he lived, although he would surely have shrunk from the implications of the second quotation, that of the book of Samuel. Mensch that he was, perhaps sometimes even a pie-eyed idealist, he always favored forgiveness over enmity and hatred. Friend, colleague, teacher, and rabbi, na'eh darash v'na'eh kiyem. He lived as he preached. And in so doing, he left his mark on many. Yehei zichro baruch. May his blessing be for our memory.
I wish to talk about Ben's teacher, Nechama Leibovich, to whom he was so devoted. Most of us who remember Rabbi Hollander from Camp Ramah and here at Beth Tzedec do not remember a Bible scholar, charismatic, model, teacher, but not a Bible scholar. But Avira Da'ara Machkima, the atmosphere of the land of Israel had its effect on Ben. And by becoming a student of Nechama Leibovitch, he became immersed in the give and take of centuries of commentary on the Chumash. We know them both as teachers, and I'd like to center in on the primal teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our master teacher. Make that my subject. I used two sources. Nechama, in her book of commentary on Exodus, and Nechama, as I remember her from my classes at the Hebrew University in 1965. 5 years after Ben and Michael were students at Machon Greenberg, I was a student at Machon Greenberg, and had the privilege of studying with Nechama at the university. The section I'd like to look at is timely, in that we're 5 weeks away from Pesach. Chapter 6 of the book of Exodus, the very beginning of the Exodus from the slavery of Egypt. Using hundreds of years of commentary and comparing the ancients with her contemporaries, Nechama points out that we cannot understand the beginning 9 verses of chapter 6 without looking at the end of chapter 5, which, by the way, is also the parasha of my bar mitzvah. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Paro to speak in your name, he has dealt worse with this people, and still you have not saved your people. That's a fairly serious accusation that Moshe is making. God answers in the first verse of chapter 6. And what he says is the equivalent of, just in that one verse, you ain't seen nothing yet. You'll see what I'm going to do here. And then chapter 6, verse 2, begins a new parasha, Parashat Va'era. And I'd like to read you those first few verses. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, Ani Hashem. I appeared to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Hashem. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And I will give it to you for a possession. Ani Hashem, I the Lord. Of course, we could play with this complex text for days. And Nechama devoted a significant amount of space to it in her commentary. But one important aspect is the connection to the last words of chapter 5. It is precisely because Moshe challenges God's might and his power of deliverance that God answers in the fashion he does. Citing the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the kind of God he was for them, is part of the answer. God promised them the land of Israel, but now as a powerful God who is the essence of being, God's name, that four-letter word, that name that we do not pronounce, as that awesome God he will deliver. And the four languages of salvation, Hotzeiti, Itzalti, Ga'alti, Lakachti, the basis for the magical significance of four in the Haggadah, 4 questions, 4 cups of wine, 4 sons. They are the signs of a new and powerful God, unlike the God who was revealed to the forefathers, tells us Nechama as she pours through the various commentators. There is much more that Nechama teaches us and that Ben Zichrono Livracha learned from her and taught others. But I must end with the sadness that I remember on Nechama's face as she taught the next verse. It's incredible that after over 40 years, I can still remember her expression as she taught this last verse. But when Moshe told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moshe. Mikotze ruach u'me'avodah kasha, due to the slave's shortness of breath caused by hard labor. Moshe failed in this first teaching of his, the first teaching of his career, because of the lack of readiness among his flock. Ben Hollander, Zichrono Livracha, must have learned the same lesson from his teacher, who learned it from the master teacher. When Ben taught, he always kept that in mind, and always knew he'd come back to teach again. As Ben always said, to be continued. Yehi Zichro Baruch.
In my capacity as Chairman of the Board of Governors of Beth Tzedec, I'd like to welcome members of Beth Tzedec, members of Beit HaMinyan, and the community at large here this evening, and thank you for being part of this most befitting commemoration at the end of Shloshim for Ben, Zichrono Livracha, our respected and beloved teacher and friend. You've already heard wonderful divrei Torah from scholarly dear friends and colleagues of Ben, and it is certainly not my intention to offer my own Dvar Torah. In preparing these few brief remarks, however, I was reminded through the book of the Torah that we just started reading, the book of Vayikra, of the various sacrifices, or korbanot, which our forefathers were commanded to perform, and that in turn led me to thinking of Ben. As you all know, the Hebrew word for sacrifice, korban, comes from the root karov, meaning to draw near. The obvious explanation, therefore, is that by performing sacrifices to God, we, his people, would be encouraged to draw near to his teachings and principles as a mode of conduct to guide us in our daily lives. While Ben made many sacrifices in his life, he managed to not only bring himself closer to God and his teachings, but more importantly, managed to bring countless other people around the world closer to God and to living a full and meaningful Jewish life. I have to look no further than around this room and notice the large number of individuals who, like me, were profoundly influenced by Ben when, as you heard, first came to Toronto in 1970 for an unfortunately much too short period of time before making Aliyah to Israel. I have no doubt that many of us are living the Jewish lives that we do today, at least in part, due to the impact that Ben had on us. Permit me to share one very simple story that I shared from the pulpit here at Beth Tzedec on the Shabbat immediately following Ben's passing, which to me epitomized the very essence of the man. I was 12 years old at the time. Ben was living in the house on Avenal, adjacent to the shul, and a Shabbat program was being held on Erev Shabbat at Beth Shalom Synagogue up on Eglinton Avenue. It happened to be one of the coldest nights that winter. Following the conclusion of the program at around 9:30 in the evening, Ben escorted me home to where I lived, about a 15-minute walk out of his way north of Eglinton, to ensure that I would get home safely. Did not accept an invitation to come inside to warm up for a few minutes, but instead turned immediately around and headed back to his home next to the shul. That total 30-minute or so walk out of his way on one of the coldest wintry nights may have been a simple sacrifice in the grand scheme of things, but it symbolized the character of the man, thoughtful, caring, and unselfish. That sacrifice on his part brought me closer to him and his inspiration, and is something that I've never forgotten. After making Aliyah, Ben often traveled, particularly around North America, several years after making Aliyah, as you heard, to share his scholarly insights with others, and to earn a few more dollars to help supplement the rather meager income that he was earning in Israel. He sacrificed time with his dear wife Judy, Zichrona Livracha, and his children in order to ultimately assist them and continue to be a powerful influence on others whom he managed to bring closer to him and to his way of life. We here at Beth Tzedec were most privileged to have Ben sacrifice his time at home in Israel during the high holidays over the last 10 or 12 years, when he would come to officiate with me as his Shaliach Tzibur in our parallel services throughout the Yamim Noraim. Perhaps not everyone always agreed with Ben's political views, but those views had to be respected and listened to as they were, because they were coming from someone who genuinely believed in the prophecy of the lion one day lying down together with the lamb in peace and harmony. His sacrifice brought others to draw nearer to perhaps a different way of thinking and approach to life in Israel. Throughout his lifetime, Ben had a remarkable way of connecting to both the young and the not so young. As he aged, he did not grow out of touch with what it took to listen to and to appeal to the younger members of our community. Even during the off-season of a professor, the summer months, Ben sacrificed his own personal time for relaxation and rejuvenation by spending summers at Camp Ramah, over the last several years for 1 month in Wisconsin and 1 month here in Canada. I was once again privileged to spend time with Ben at Camp Ramah in Canada in recent years, and I was therefore able to witness firsthand the continued impact and influence that he had on both the campers and the staff. His sacrifice brought hundreds nearer to Jewish text and a normative Jewish existence. Finally, how many among us are able to be counted as one of the hundreds, perhaps thousands, who while in Jerusalem were invited to Ben's and Judy's table for Shabbat lunch? Those lunches often brought together an eclectic group of individuals who in common experienced tremendous warmth and hospitality, a wonderful meal, political discussion, and words of Torah, all in a most relaxed and enjoyable atmosphere. Ben and Judy sacrificed their own personal time for rest and relaxation in order to give to others and to draw us closer to what was so meaningful and enriching in their lives. These few personal experiences do not even mention the many other ways, including in particular as a teacher in various academic institutions in Israel, that Ben touched the lives of so many others in such a profound and meaningful way. In a way, Ben was the consummate proselytizer, but in a manner that was subtle, sincere, and genuine. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Ben's memory will be for a tremendous blessing, and that the influence and inspiration that he has had on thousands will remain with us for the rest of our lives. As some of you may have heard or seen advertised, a fund has been established here at Beth Tzedec in memory of Ben. While the ultimate use of the funds has not yet been determined, it is hoped that there will be sufficient monies raised to advance two of the foremost principles of Ben's life, Torah and Israel, in a way that will symbolize Ben's lifelong pursuits and aspirations. I hope that each of you will contact the synagogue office, if you have not already done so, and make the small sacrifice of a donation to this fund, which will hopefully enable others to draw closer to the ideals that were so deeply cherished and practiced by Ben. Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing.
We'll have an opportunity over coffee for individuals to share their reflections about Ben. This program has been recorded. It's going to be available on the web at the Beth Tzedec online video library, probably in about a week or 10 days. Takes a little bit of time to process. I'll ask that you stand. Howard, who was the Shaliach Tzibur for Ben for many years, will lead us in the Kel Malei Rachamim, and following that, those who wish are also invited to recite Kaddish D'Rabbanan, because we've certainly studied in memory of Ben. And then coffee, cake, conversation, the kinds of things that Ben liked to stay late in order to do.
El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bameromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanafei HaShechina, B'Mahalot Kedoshim Utehorim, Kizor Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat Moreinu Harav Binyamin Ben Sarah Shalach Leolamo Began Eden Tehei Menuchato Anna Bal Harachamim Hastirehu Beseter Knafecha Leolamim V'titzror Bitzror Achayim Et Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato Yanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkavo V'nomar Amen. Gadol v'Kadash Mei Rabbah V'Yalma Divra Chirutei V'Yamlich Malchutei V'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael ba'agala v'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mivorach leolam olamei amaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei v'yithadar v'yitale v'yitalal shmei d'kudasha brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata Da'amiran v'yalma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidei-hon v'al kol Talmidei-hon v'al kol man dioskin bo'araita di v'yatra hadein v'di b'chol atar v'atar Yehei lahon u'lachon shlama rabba china v'chizda v'rachamin v'chayin arichin umzonei refiche Ufurkana min kodam abuon devishmaya v'ara v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav u'brachamav yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Thank you all very much for joining us.